Welcome to Green and Red, scrappy politics for scrappy people. A regular podcast on radical, environmental and anti-capitalist politics. Brought to you by Bob Bazanko and Scott Parkin.
Welcome to the silky smooth sounds of the Green and Red podcast. I'm your co-host, Scott Parkin, in Berkeley, California today. And as always, I am joined by
Bob Bazanko from lovely Houston, Texas, where the heat index is only, I think, like 109 or something like that. So, nice and cool.
Nice and cool. And actually, speaking of heat, we're going to be talking a little bit about the heat that's happening in Chicago this week at the Democratic National Convention. And Bob, I know that you were part of that roll call the other night and did the rowdy rockin' let's bring in the Harris Walz ticket, because hope and change is on its way. It's on its way.
Yeah, that's the key to an election, playing like Stevie Wonder and Megan Thee Stallion. Back in the old days, Fleetwood Mac with Bill Clinton. That's what you need, those kinds of performative, symbolic things that'll bring you over the finish line.
It's like a Hollywood, it was like a Hollywood movie. It just made me feel warm and fuzzy as I didn't watch it.
Yeah.
So folks, today we're going to be talking about the Democrats, one of our favorite topics, as you all know. We're going to be talking a little bit about the history of the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. We're going to talk about 1968, and then we're going to talk about 2024. And so maybe to kick it off, I'm gonna pass it over to Bob just to start us off.
Yeah, one of the themes that we've stressed over these many years now has been the Democrats, what their ideology really stands for, liberals, and especially their evolution, their rapid and very abrupt evolution going further and further to the right. In fact, we did a show a couple of years ago with Noam Chomsky all about this. And so this is a really important time because Chicago is in the news again. And you know how the media loves us, the Windy City, Chi-Town, or Chirac, if you prefer that, right? And so I think
that's what they call on Fox News and the right-wing media.
Yeah. And just for kicks, I even wore this shirt today. It's
68.
Yeah, 1968. Yeah. So it's a John Carlo shirt, but anyway, I figured it was appropriate. 68 kind of has mythic qualities in the study of U.S. history. People talk about 1968 with great reverence or fear. And it was a very melodramatic year. And in fact, it really was. When we think about the traumas we've had in the last several years, 1968 is up there. The year began fairly early with the Tet Offensive, which just destroyed what little credibility was left in the U.S. government. The war in Vietnam, they had just months earlier said the lights are at the end of the tunnel. Victory is coming. It's just a matter of time. Pretty soon we can start withdrawing troops. And Tet clearly undermined that. It led to a reappraisal of the war in Vietnam and a global economic crisis. And shortly after that, just a month and a half after that, there was the New Hampshire primary where Lyndon Johnson, the incumbent, was on the ballot. But Eugene McCarthy, who was running an insurgent anti-Vietnam War campaign fueled by what he called the kids, people who really weren't into electoral politics, like SDS activists and VVAW, anti-war vets, went all over, especially to New Hampshire, to campaign door to door. And McCarthy got 43% of the vote against the sitting president. The only thing comparable to that, Pat Buchanan did that to Bush, right? In the 92, was it? Or I think.
Yep.
So if you have, even this year, the numbers weren't as big, but Nikki Haley actually polled quite well against Trump, right? Who's basically an incumbent.
And she was, and Nikki Haley, even after she dropped out, I think it was before she endorsed Trump, but she was still, after she was dropped out, was still getting like 20% of the vote because she was still on the ballot.
And yeah, and if an incumbent has that kind of opposition, that's obviously not a good sign. And Humphrey recognized that. And I think we can talk about this later. Going back to it, I think the uncommitted vote in certain primaries this year is certainly relevant and similar, I think, to that. But LBJ saw the writing on the wall. And so on March 31st, he gave a speech where he announced a bombing halt in Vietnam, which is important because Johnson recognized that Vietnam was destroying the Democratic Party. And then he withdrew from the race, which was quite stunning. At that point, Bobby Kennedy had just jumped in and seemed to be a front runner. But the reality is, Kennedy was never going to get the nomination. Once Johnson withdrew, his vice president, sound familiar, right? Hubert Humphrey ran. And the convention was set up differently. Like the actual primaries and votes didn't matter much. Most of the delegates were what we would today call super delegates. They were party officials, labor officials, and so on. And I remember many years ago, Lane Kirkland, who had just been removed as president of the AFL-CIO, had an office at the Labor Archives in Maryland. Got a chance to talk to him, and he said, he's like, in 68, we took care of it. Kennedy was never going to be the nominee. It was always going to be Humphrey. And Humphrey was begging Johnson to remove Vietnam from the picture. Vietnam was an albatross around his neck, just like Gaza is today, right? And
it was an albatross around Biden's neck, to be clear for folks.
And it could be. We'll have to see what it does for Harris. And then Johnson withdraws. Kennedy has momentum. And then in early April 1968, Martin Luther King was killed, which led to uprisings in most cities, these big cities, urban areas in America. And the Democratic mayors who were in charge of pretty much every single city in America at that point responded fairly vigorously, like we've been seeing this year, like with the campus protests, right? And in Chicago, the mayor, Richard Daley, who's famous or infamous, however you want to look at it, actually told the police to shoot to kill in the April 1968 protests. It's an incredibly problematic year. It's full of all this fury and fire, just like 2024 is, right? And amid that, the Democrats' convention was scheduled for August, and a bunch of young, especially young activists, not all, called for major protests there. And they were the Yippies, SDS, entertainers like Phil Oakes, Abby Hoffman, and Jerry Rubin all went to Chicago.
The National Moratorium to End the War.
And so it was a combination, like Abby Hoffman and Jerry Rubin and the Yippies brought a festive atmosphere to it. They brought a pig with them. They called Pegasus, who they were going to nominate for president. And
they said that they were gonna spike the Chicago water supply with LSD.
LSD, right? You would have to put a lot of LSD in there to make a difference, right?
Apparently, it would have required more LSD than was actually in existence at the time.
Probably, and I do think they did. I think they threw food coloring in the water just to freak people out, or something like that. When the convention finally came, it was what a commission led by Otto Kerner, who was the governor of Illinois, later described as a police riot. And we've talked about Aaron Sorkin, not necessarily favorably. Wasn't his most recent idea, the screenwriter Aaron Sorkin? I think recently, did he say that the Democrats should nominate like Mitt Romney for president or something like that?
Yeah, but, that's how he would script it. I believe that's the exact quote.
Yeah, but he actually did a show for Netflix, I believe, about 1968, about Chicago, which was actually quite good. And in it, you get a sense of just how vigorous the police were, how brutal it was. It was, like I said, turned up a police riot. And there are famous scenes on TV, right, where they'll show the police going ape on these folks and beating them and pushing them through windows. And the
attacking the activists in Lincoln Park.
Yeah, Lincoln
Park. Which actually was the scene of other stuff this week.
Yeah, and the crowd is yelling, the whole world is watching. And this took place actually at the same time the Soviet Union had sent tanks into Hungary. And the Czechoslovakia, I'm sorry, 1956 was Hungary. And the Democrats were upset because they lost an opportunity to emphasize what the Soviet Union had just done, because in the United States, they're beating the hell out of people in the streets. And at that point, Humphrey did get the nomination. His campaign was foundering. He finally convinced LBJ in later October to announce a bombing halt and to call for a convention of peace talks, which were undermined by Nixon and Kissinger, who used back-channel contacts in Vietnam with Nguyen Van Tu, Claire Chennault actually, and Kissinger, to tell them not to accept any peace proposal that LBJ and Humphrey put forward, that they'd get a better deal if they were elected in early 1969. And reports came out yesterday that Trump, because Trump doesn't do anything behind the scenes or secretively, Trump has been making overtures to Netanyahu, telling him, don't accept anything Biden suggests, because once I become president again, I'll give you even more weapons, which I don't know how you could do that anyway, but how could you support genocide more? We want a little more genocide. Give me some extra genocide.
As many blue MAGAs on Twitter keep telling me, is that Gaza is going to be snuffed out like a cigarette. It's going to be wiped off the map. Is it not already?
Yeah. And yeah, because
how many more babies are they going to kill?
Only Republicans would do that. Like not Biden and Blinken and Clinton and Harris and all that. So at any rate, and Humphrey lost the election. People make a big deal out of how narrow it was, but the reality is George Wallace won 3 or 4 southern states. And if he hadn't been in the race, those weren't going to Humphrey. Despite what they say, blah, 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 Nixon won the election. And LBJ later said he truly regretted dropping out, because his whole life he was preparing to, those are the two titans, really. You could argue in 20th century history, there's Wilson, FDR, and then Johnson and Nixon are the biggest figures in 20th century American political history.
And Reagan, I would say Reagan.
Yeah. But the thing about like Nixon and Johnson is though, and Reagan, they came up through the Senate. They had this, in the House, the Senate, all that kind of stuff. But yeah, in terms of ideological change. And Johnson apparently regretted that withdrawing because he thought he would have beat Nixon. Nixon won. He defeated Humphrey.
It was a very slim margin by which he.
Yeah, it was. But again, like I said, Wallace probably made it closer than it would have been. I think if Wallace hadn't run, Nixon is probably going to win those 4 southern states. But yeah, it was a close election. And Humphrey was gaining at the end. In October, the poll showed him like gaining fairly quickly. And that's when the Win Van 2 came out and scuttled Johnson's peace proposal, and that ended kind of the momentum there. And this is all very relevant to 2024. But I think the point I think that's important, and we've talked about this again many times, is what was learned from 1968. What did the Democrats learn from 1968? What did the Republicans learn from 1968? What did the activists learn from 1968? For the GOP, for the Republicans, it was that you could beat the hell out of the Democrats for being too radical. Right? You'd had red baiting and all that, obviously, but the Democratic Party, Harry Truman had gotten rid of communists, and JFK was good friends with McCarthy and all that kind of stuff. So the GOP finally made it stick that the Democratic Party was this party of kind of crazies, and they were out in the streets. And Richard Nixon ran a campaign based on law and order, just like we're seeing today. They called the Democrats the party of acid, amnesty, and abortion. And so they learned that you attack aggressively and viciously, and they've been doing it ever since. The Democrats' lesson from that wasn't that, hey, we should get into these wars in places like Vietnam, and we should be encouraging police to beat the shit out of people in the streets. The Democrats' lesson was the same as the Republicans' lesson, which is we need to move further to the right and distance ourselves from these people. And this is like where we are today. This is when it really gets started. Because 4 years earlier, Lyndon Johnson ran as an unabashed liberal in favor of civil rights. He says, I'm not going to send I'll tell the American mamas, the mamas of America, I'm not going to send your boys to fight diabetes. Of course he did.
One thing that when we were talking yesterday about this episode that you pointed out to me is, and which differs from today, is that there was not only were there 10,000 activists in the street in Chicago, but there was probably a majority, definitely a very large anti-war delegation in the Democratic Party in the convention, which was actually fighting it out with the pro-war delegation. Yeah. I believe physically there was like physical
there were
outbursts of confrontation, violence, and daily, and all that sort of.
The McCarthy people proposed a plank in the platform to end the war in Vietnam, immediate ceasefire, and obviously the party leaders didn't want that. They weren't going to do that again, much like today. And so it did become a very vigorous fight, which gave rise to one of the greatest scenes in political history. George McGovern was a late minute kind of addition, a nomination. He hadn't run in the campaign, but he decided he would run at Chicago. He was being nominated. And I think Abraham Ribicoff, who was a senator from Connecticut, I believe was seconding his nomination. And he said, there are currently, we need to end the war, bring the boys home, and this domestic, conflict we have going on as well.
Or the Gestapo tactics of the Chicago
there are
police.
Gestapo tactics in the streets of Chicago. And Daley is furious. You can see him, and lip readers have variously said he gets angry. And lip readers have said, some people said he said, sit down, you fucking Jew. Others said he's yelling, fuck you. Daley's people said, no, he was yelling, you're a faker. So who knows? Who knows what the truth is? But he clearly was not happy. So the Democrats were terribly fractured and falling apart, much like the Democrats were up until, a month ago, right, with Joe Biden. And a lot of people, including us, were saying, hey, Biden should take the lesson of Johnson in 1968. And Johnson's political position was far stronger than Biden's was. And I think, and we've said this just in the past few weeks, that the media and political narrative is that the debate killed Biden. And obviously that did. It was a disaster. I didn't see it, but everybody I've talked to, everything I've read said it was an utter disaster. It could not have gone worse. But I think what's missing in this, and something that we have to bring up because the media isn't going through, is Biden was vulnerable and weakened because of Gaza, because of these protests, these unrelenting protests since last October, and especially this spring and summer on campuses all over the United States with the encampments. So he was already terribly weakened by Gaza when he finally was convinced to withdraw.
Yeah, I think that, and I think that the uncommitted votes in particularly critical states like Michigan and
Minnesota, Maryland.
They were big in Maryland and Hawaii, which I think
Yeah.
are less critical to Biden's reelection. But Minnesota is like on the verge, and Michigan is definitely a critical swing state. And
Well, and Michigan obviously has a huge Arab population too.
and I think it's very important to note that the undermining started once he said he had his ironclad commitment to Israel starting on before October 7th. And then when those primaries came up and they were 20-30% of people were voting uncommitted. And then we had these campus protests, which helped with that. But in comparison to 1968, that strong, in comparison to 1968, there's not really that strong establishment politician opposition to what's going on in Gaza. A handful of people, two of which have actually been primaried out of office in the last month or two.
Yeah. Yeah, because in 1968, you're looking at William Fulbright, who had hearings 2 years earlier about how badly the war was going. And Fulbright was a giant, right? McGovern, McCarthy, RFK ran as an anti-war candidate, right? Even though he had been gung ho along with his brother, who were not trying to get out of Vietnam, despite what Oliver Stone says. We have to get that in because we always do, right?
Yeah, fuck Oliver Stone.
And so the Democrats and Republicans actually took the same lesson, right? Rather than say, hey, Democrats especially, they could have said, hey, Vietnam is killing us, or this support of Israel is killing us, right? How many times has Joe Biden said, well, ceasefire is near, and then obviously nothing happens and the U.S. sends them another 3.5 billion or 18 billion or whatever. So the Democrats and Republicans either didn't learn a lesson or learned the same lesson from it. But what's more interesting, I think, and more important for us is what activists took from 1968. And again, there's no particular activist position. Like Democrats and Republicans, you could say, okay, this is what they learned. But a lot of activists, I think, took a similar lesson that these establishment figures did in 1968, because much later, people like Todd Gitlin, who was one of the leaders of SDS, other SDS leaders, I believe Mark Rudd, although not exactly sure of that, but many of them later came around and said, you know what, we screwed up. We shouldn't have done what we did in Chicago. We should have destroyed Humphrey's campaign, and we'd have been better off if Humphrey had won rather than Nixon. So they recanted what they had done. And first of all, I'm not sure they destroyed Humphrey's campaign. I think Vietnam destroyed Humphrey's campaign, right? And Johnson's failure to actually address it before it was too late really destroyed. But I think, and since then, we've seen activism change, right? And there are tons of reasons for that, which aren't really worth going into at this point. But occasionally you'll see something like 1968, but it's spontaneous, right? So you'll have, and most notably 2020, the summer of 2020, which you had this festering explosion, right, with the George Floyd murder, and people were in the streets. But by and large, in 1968, that was just the way. Well, for years before that, right, you had the civil rights movement in the streets for up to a decade, but before that, and then SDS had been very active. Anti-war groups had been very active for years prior to 1968 too. So the convention in 1968, clearly that eruption there and that flurry, that orgy of police violence was startling, it was striking, but it had been building up to that. And I think a lot of activists since then have attached their fortunes to the Democratic Party. And as you pointed out, in 1968, you did have people like Abraham Ribicoff was a U.S. senator who was calling the police in Chicago Gestapo, right? More recently, just now at the convention, 2 days ago, AOC, who a few years ago was the new Emma Goldman for American Left, right? AOC gave a rousing speech in defense of Kamala Harris, right?
Bernie did it last night, actually.
Yeah. I think, didn't Sanders call for a ceasefire in Gaza?
He did call for a ceasefire. AOC also said that Harris is making a ceasefire happen.
Yeah.
But Bernie also didn't call it a genocide. He called it a war. He actually said that the hostages need to be returned. Basically, there's both sides.
And see, and that's been, okay, so in a perfect world, we wouldn't give a shit what the Democratic Party or what Congress or Senator or anybody says, but this isn't a perfect world. And we don't have the juice to make these changes by ourselves, right? There's not such a strong, big, and vigorous left to do that. And so in 1968, it was really crucial to have, RFK and McGovern and McCarthy running very strongly and explicitly as anti-war candidates, right?
Yeah.
And no one is doing that today. Honestly, in the last several months, okay, obviously you have Rashida Tlaib, Cori Bush, Jamal Bowman. Bush and Bowman have just been defeated, who are but that's about it. Other than that, I would say the strongest critic has been Thomas Massey, who's a crazy batshit right-winger from Kentucky, I believe he boycotted Netanyahu's speech, didn't he?
Yeah, and I believe it's because he's anti-Semitic and he's more than anything.
No, I don't doubt that. I don't doubt He's not. It's not
Explicitly, overtly anti-Semitic.
Yeah, I'm just saying that's how bad it is, right? That like, he comes out like, when he talks about not, but when he talks about aid to Israel, he's actually saying this is a bad idea. Even Rand Paul will vote for it, but even Rand Paul will say that, right? Whereas Bernie Sanders is about as good as you'll get. There are others who, like, I think Chris Murphy has said a few things, and others. But the reality is, my point here, which I think is important, is it helps a lot if you have that kind of establishment opposition to the war that you could piggyback on. It makes you seem less crazy, less far out there, right? If you're saying the same thing that William Fulbright is saying, although you're doing it in a different way and you're wearing different clothes and the police don't like you, it's still important. Whereas today you have these people in the streets who are being pummeled by everybody, right? Except for this very small handful of the squad, or people who aren't going to be in the squad anymore because they just lost their primaries because AIPAC funneled so much money into it.
I think it's also important to note on different issues where we see a right-wing mobilization in the street, which may or may not be grassroots, whatever, is that they're actually validated because their politicians in various levels of government, from local to state to federal, all support their right-wing crazy demands and ideologies and things like that. Whereas you don't see that for people in the street and the left, particularly on this issue, but on many other issues as well.
Yeah.
Like on climate issues, you see a few more politicians showing up at rallies and things like that, or doing things in Congress that are supportive of the activists, but not like we're talking about with 1968, where like half of the Democrats in the Senate were overtly, explicitly calling for an end to the war in Vietnam.
And some Republicans too, Packwood and Hatfield. John Sherman Cooper from Kentucky, not exactly a radical state. No. Yeah, and that is important. AOC ain't going to cut it. I think she's angling probably to become a senator or something, because she's clearly a good Democrat now. She's fallen in. But I think the sense that I get is that, and I've studied this a lot, I've actually written about it, so I know a little bit. I'm not I don't write for Jacobin. Writing for Jacobin is like staying at a Holiday Inn, right?
You're no Rick Perlstein, but...
Not exactly, right? Who gets very upset when people criticize Kamala now, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think what's troubling for me is that everybody learned the same lesson, which is that if you're too far left, whatever that means, right? Because somehow opposing genocides in Vietnam, which was brutal, the U.S. killed 3 million Vietnamese, right? And they used Agent Orange, and they committed war crimes every day, right? People throw the term genocide around a lot, right? And it's a loaded term, but Vietnam is, what's that, right? Mm-hmm. And clearly we're seeing that today. And so they've equated this idea that if you oppose whatever, war crimes, atrocities, genocide, whatever you want to call it, if you oppose that, you're somehow radical, too far out there. You're outside the mainstream, right? Even though a majority of Americans believe in that. That's what the Democrats learned from 1968. Yeah, a majority of Americans may be with us, but we have to respond to Nixon and Reagan and Lee Atwater and Dick Cheney and Jim Baker. We have to respond to what they're saying and what they're doing, and try to shield ourselves from our own left, right? The Republicans have embraced those January 6th crazies, right? What's Trump calling them now? Political prisoners or something like that, or hostages, or what the hell?
He calls the ones in jail political prisoners.
Political prisoners, and I think somebody called them a hostage too. The Democratic Party runs away from those people. They can't get far enough away from those people, right?
Yeah, it's true.
And I think, and that's clearly one of the problems. We're seeing that right now, right? Because these protests in the spring, which were inspirational, students was like, by the end of it, 160, 180 campuses had encampments, right? And many of these, not Texas, of course, but many of these, California, New York, Massachusetts, took place in states which were Illinois, deep blue states, right? Democratic governors, Democratic mayors, and so forth. And the response was vicious, right? At Columbia, at UCLA, I think at MIT, or I forget, one of the Massachusetts schools, but all over. And
MIT, what's the North? Is it Northeastern? That's in
Northeastern, yeah.
Yeah, both of those have pretty. MIT.
And Ohio State's is a red state too, but they had snipers on the buildings at Ohio State and Columbus, right? Which Columbus is actually a Democratic town, right?
Yeah.
And these university presidents who were supposed to be promoting a liberal education are as bad as anybody, right? And it's great they've been forced out, and the right wing is taking credit for forcing them out, which why not, right? But I'm not upset about it. They should all be shit canned, right? These people tried to play that middle ground. We're gonna attack these pro-Palestinian protesters, and we're gonna send the police out on them. We're gonna arrest them. We're gonna kick them out of school. We're gonna suspend them, not give them their grades, not let them graduate, and all that kind of stuff, right? And they got no thanks for it, because all they did was get pummeled even more by the right wing, accusing them of coddling Hamas terrorists or some bullshit like that. And go ahead.
I just want to say, just because I want to talk a little bit about what strategy that's going on with the anti-genocide movement and the left right now around this. And on that particular thing that you're talking about is that at Columbia, and I think at UCLA and some of these other more elite universities, is that the students actually played this pretty well and were like pretty strategic about it. And Columbia in particular, which it seemed to me to be the sort of epicenter of where all this sort of like emerged from, is that Manoush Shafek like was basically triangulated by the Republicans and by the anti-genocide students on her campus to the point where she had to step down the other week, which is good. I'm glad. She had to take an unpaid job for a bank in London is what she's doing now. She should be working at Burger King or something like that.
Yeah. She's a lord or a peer or whatever the hell it's called.
She's like an Egyptian countess or something.
Very well. But yeah, and see, in 1968, university presidents were out there protesting. University presidents read it a lot better. So you did have some universities saying the police are out of hand and this is out of control. And I think there was more, especially after Kent State in 1970, which scared the shit out of everybody. And Kent and Jackson State in 1968.
I do want to say one factor that's a little bit different from 1968 is the influence of AIPAC and the Zionist lobby on all of these institutions, which I think, which to me is actually even worse within liberal institutions, whether it's university or politics or whatever, which is partially why I think that we've seen this heavy-handed response to a lot of these street protests. But still, anti-genocide, anti-war students have been like brilliant in creating this crisis and triangulating both politicians and university administrators. I also feel like the uncommitted movement has been pretty brilliant in showing that Biden was weak and that there's like a significant portion of his electorate who vote in his primary, which have no faith in him, like no faith at all. And so while I don't think the movement has been as big and we're not seeing the big numbers like we saw in 2003, or that we saw probably even in 1960, 67, 1968, 1970, things like that. Or in 2020, we are basically seeing a lot of really smart thinking from activists, which is always very impressive. And the Democrats support a lot of money into organizing for turnout and being strategic and campaigning for the last 20 years, since at least the Bush years. And now it's a little bit of minor backlash coming on them because now we have all these smart organizers. And as the people know, organizing is a very noble profession, which I'm one of. So I just want to praise that.
In 1968, Johnson and the Democrats were always, and even before that, were attacking these protesters as communists. It's being motivated. Ho Chi Minh is supporting them. They're pro-Viet Cong and this and that. And the fact of the matter was, like, most Americans wanted to get out of Vietnam. They were opposed to the war. And today, what you have is what Biden calls this ferocious anti-Semitism, right? And that's really all that's left. That's all they got left, right? Because they can no longer make any kind of affirmative argument in favor of what Israel's doing. You just can't. Right. In Israel, they have members who are just saying, yeah, we're going to kill everybody. We're going to take over the West Bank and we don't really care. They're animals. They're not humans, blah, blah, blah. Right. But that whole kind of everybody's anti-Semitic, that's not working. People aren't buying that who aren't already convinced of that. Right. Republicans are going to say you're a socialist and you're anti-Semitic no matter what. They're calling
or you're pro-Hamas. Pro-Hamas is a big.
Twitter is full of Kamala Harris is a communist, and you can't even argue with that. She's so clear. You can't. You're not going to convince people like that. But going around calling everybody anti-Semitic is not a great idea. It's not giving you any support. Did you see the poll? I think I sent it to you, where in a lot of these swing states, big numbers, like 30, 40, 50% in some cases of people there said they would be more likely to vote for the Democrats if there was a ceasefire in Gaza. And the Democrats are essentially looking at their own people, their own constituents, the people they claim to represent, the people whose votes they want, and essentially saying, flipping in the middle finger, biting, right?
Yeah.
And the GOP doesn't do that no matter how fucking crazy you are. The GOP embraces you. They got rid of Lynn Cheney from the most demonic family, one of the most demonic families in Republican history, because she wasn't hardcore enough.
Yeah.
Whereas the Democrats, nobody said a word from the White House that I know of. Nobody said a word in support of Jamal Bowman or Cori Bush. And after Cori Bush lost, she explicitly said, hey, AIPAC took me in. AIPAC openly spent $8 million in a congressional race in Missouri. And she was attacked by, who's the press, Karen St. Pierre, is that her name, the press secretary?
She was attacked by the White House, basically.
What's that?
She was attacked by the White House, basically.
Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah, Biden, she tells you what Biden tells her to say, or whoever was in charge at that point, Jill or Blinken or whoever. And they attacked Cori Bush. How dare she say that AIPAC, that's anti-Semitic, right? So the Democratic Party is essentially hoping that this switch is a bait and switch, right? we'll listen to you, but you got to vote for Kamala, right? And the switch, Kamala Harris is an exponentially better candidate than Biden, no doubt about it. Frankly, a stop sign might be a better candidate than Biden, right? She has that going for her. She speaks in sentences, sometimes jibber jabber, but mostly in sentences. And she presents herself, she's glamorous. And when she has the Obamas on board and all this kind of stuff. But if you look beyond that, and they're going through some performative things in Chicago right now, 2024, didn't they have a breakfast for Palestinian activists or something like that? I believe maybe Walls went to it and said hello to people or something like that.
Yeah, I think they're doing stuff like that. They're doing a lot. I think they had a panel within the DNC with the uncommitted delegation as well. They're trying to do a lot of engagement there. And I will say, we're going to have a couple people we're going to probably talk to a couple people this week who are in Chicago. They actually wanted like a 30,000 person march in Chicago on Monday. And I think the numbers were much under that, which has led the media and media pundits to say, oh, it's fizzled in Chicago, which I think is ridiculous. But I also want to say that the Chicago police actually seem much more hands-off than what I expected. There has been some brutality. I also know there's ongoing political tension between the progressive mayor of Chicago, Brandon Johnson, and the Chicago police. But it seems that Democrats have also said we don't want images like we saw in 1968 coming out in this moment. And that's all to say is that they're doing a lot of, I would actually say some of the stuff they're doing where they're doing engagement with the pro-Palestinian anti-genocide movement is, I still consider it performative based on the fact that 2 weeks ago, Biden and Harris sent $3 billion to Israel.
They keep sending them weapons, You can't say we're against the war, we want a ceasefire, and then keep sending up weapons, right? It's like a junkie. You keep giving a junkie one more hit. Yeah, I'm going to stop. I promise. This is my last hit. One more. That's all I need. One more.
I'll say that Harris has stated, I took this quote for this episode, is, I believe the bonds between the people of the United States and the people of Israel are unbreakable, and we can never let anyone drive a wedge between us. And so I think a lot of the AOC talking about the ceasefire, that Harris is working on a ceasefire, and that when they throw that out there, I feel like it's mostly performative. And strategically, as an anti-war, anti-genocide activist and organizer, this is the moment where we need to be putting the pressure on them, because this is when they're most vulnerable. And Bob and I have actually talked about this quite a bit, is that as much as we despise the Democrats in power, we don't want to see Trump elected either. So just to be clear about that, where these are neoliberal warmongers, which are feeding wars in Ukraine and Israel and being very provocative and with China, Trump is a sociopath and would be much worse. So just to put that out there, it's a little bit like when we used to talk about Ukraine, was like, we don't like Putin, we don't like what the US is doing.
And actually, with regard to things like China and the Middle East, I'm not sure Trump would be any worse. It's stuff like here at home, right?
Yeah.
People we care about. He's talked about deporting people. And in the summer of 2020, you had those snatch and grabs by ICE and these federal police forces. You can see more of that. And that's a concern. That's terrifying. But what we're talking about an election here, this is one of the bigger points, right? Everybody's obsessed about an election, and I get it. It's a tactic, blah, 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 if you want to vote. Like, I don't want Trump to win, but I'm not going to give Kamala Harris a penny. And I live in Texas, so it doesn't matter. I'm not going to vote for her. But Trump is dangerous. He's a really bad dude. And this is where we are. And the reason we're at this moment in time where Trump and Biden and then Harris are the candidates is because of the lessons of 1968, because everybody got the same thing from it, right? Like today, I'm sure there are a lot of conversations in activist circles saying, in 1968, we killed Humphrey's chances and we brought Nixon to office, so we can't do that again. I got to believe that's being said, and especially by older people, right? Because I've recently read a lot of articles by people who were active in 1968. They're much older, who are recanting and regretting what they did. And so I suspect activists are taking the same thing. And they're basically, as you just pointed out, like, you don't pressure somebody after things are over. You have no leverage at that point, right? If you notice, Harris has really done very well in the polling. Michigan is the one place that's still a dead heat, right? She's pulled ahead in a lot of these other places. 5 of the 7 swing states, I think.
And Michigan's been a big Democratic state the last couple of cycles too.
Right. And what's the issue in Michigan? What is the uncommitted vote in Michigan was huge. There's a huge Arab population, which is heavily Democratic, right? And that's what's keeping her down. If she were to come out and say, you know what, you don't have to sound like me and you. You could come out there and say, hey, look, this is a tragedy. It's going on for too long. People are dying, blah, blah, blah. You're probably going to pull ahead in Michigan by 3 or 4 points, right? And so they obviously don't care. Their basic line is, I think, that line from, what is it, Caddyshack, you'll get nothing and you'll like it, right? That's what the Democrats say. We're not going to give you anything, but you're going to like it. Because look at what the other side is even worse, right? And, which is what we've been hearing. In 1968, the Democrats went through a rules change because Humphrey wasn't elected. It was funny, Trump and all these people saying Harris had a coup, right? Parties can make their own rules up. They can do whatever the fuck they want, right? They don't have to have primary. They can do anything they want. And in 1968, they did. Humphrey was the choice of the party establishment, and that was that. So they changed the rules. And if you look at scenes, it's hilarious, from the 1968 convention in Chicago, which is full of people who look like Daley, right? Old jowly white guys with crew cuts and suits.
Brillo hair.
Well, yeah. And then you look at 1972, and you got Jesse Jackson and the dashiki, and you have women out there, and McGovern got destroyed, right? And from that point on, and I think the Democrats may have done that to set him up, right? We talked about this with Chomsky, and we've done a show on it ourselves. Right? The Democrats were not that upset about it, right? Because that was they could say, look at what McGovern did to us. Look at what the left did to us, right? And that's what gives rise to Jimmy Carter and neoliberalism, and then Reagan, and then Clinton, and the DLC, and the crime bill, and an end to welfare as we know it, right? This all stems. So 1968 is a really pivotal year. And I think in 2024, you're seeing just a step in that process, the kind of fruition of what 1968 created.
It's that sort of old New Deal coalition is where it like unwinds or falls apart. And that's when we see that sort of white ethnic and labor folks just peel away. And Nixon, to his credit, with people like Kevin Phillips and Pat Buchanan, come up with the Southern strategy. They also see what Wallace does in 1968 and some of the Deep South states, and basically drives a pretty hardcore wedge into that, which the Republicans have been exploiting ever since.
Yeah. And the Democrats haven't fought back. People always say the Democrats are a corporate party too. Like, we don't know that. I've only been studying it. And so, yeah, they are, but there is this element of political fecklessness and cowardice and fear, right? That has nothing to do with ideology, because in 2020, Americans supported the protest. They supported the freaking burning, arson in a police headquarters in Minneapolis, right?
It's true.
And I saw a thing today praising AOC because she has abandoned the left-wing ideas she brought to office. What were those left-wing ideas? Housing, healthcare, wages, gun violence, the environment, abortion rights. Those are all issues that have strong majority support within the United States. These kind of talking head types, that's far left stuff, and you have to abandon. So AOC is now, the word you often use is responsible, right? They said about King, Martin Luther King was no longer a responsible Negro, right? RFK was no longer a responsible liberal, right? And so this is what we're getting, right? This idea to be legitimate, to be credible, to be accepted, to be responsible means you abandon those ideas. Like, crazy notion that genocide is bad, right? This is where we are, right?
Which is also, we have a majority of Americans this year which have been wanting a ceasefire in Gaza.
Yeah. I don't understand how people can be so casual about what's happening in Gaza. That's not one thing. That's not a train derailment in East Palestine, which is particularly important to me because that's 30 minutes from where I live in Ohio. Right? This is a mass atrocity. The Lancet, which is a conservative journal, about a month ago estimated 186,000 dead. The number has been 40,000 dead for 6 months now because they're not allowing any counts to come in, right? And again, genocide doesn't rely on numbers. You could have a genocide with nobody killed, actually, right? But the fact is, you have this massive atrocity, whether it's 40,000 or 186,000, 200,000, who knows? In addition to the visions, these just horrific images we see. And people are casual. Yeah, sure, there's a genocide in Gaza, but we can't elect Trump. Trump's a bad guy.
Trump is bad. Trump is bad,
right? And it is, but so is Biden. And what Biden is suggesting in China and supporting the Ukraine is just creating more distress and more mayhem in the world. Trump's tariffs would make it even worse. If you want a position on that matters, I think, on which there's a difference, I think it's tariffs. Tariffs really monkey wrench the economy, right? Like they did last time, right? Tax policy, tariffs, right? Otherwise, yeah, they're pretty similar. Normally, I would say the Democrats are less likely to send the police out to beat the shit out of people, but after last spring, you really can't say that, right?
No.
Maybe they're not going to try to invoke the Insurrection Act like Trump will, but there's not a huge difference there. And if you look at somebody like Hillary Clinton, who they keep trotting out, like, that's amazing. Like Hillary Clinton, after what she did, should be afraid to show her face And she stands up there and she's so smug and condescending. Or even Kamala, when a speech was disrupted and what did she say? I'm speaking, right? I don't want to hear you tell you, I'm speaking. You want Trump elected? That's all they have. Why is it so hard to say, you know what, Israel's gone over the line. They've gone too far. People I know who are avid, like pro-Zionists are now saying this has gone too far, right? There's an audience to listen to. There's an audience that wants to hear that. Israel's gone too far.
I think actually that's a really important point too, is that there's a lot of people who I know in my life, this is anecdotal, and people that we've actually talked to on the podcast or not necessarily on the record, but who, in my estimation, are Zionist adjacent, right? Zionist friendly. And they're all like, what's going on in Gaza is fucked up and it needs to end. Or what Manoush Shafek did at Columbia to the students who were peacefully protesting is bad. I can't believe they did. They should have just let them stay.
Yeah.
There's when you're organizing, you want those people who are like neutral or passively with you to move over into like actively with you, and that's what is the result of that.
Yeah,
whether it's an election, whether it's in voting, or whether it's in like marching with you in the streets.
Sean Fain has come out against the war, but he's endorsing Harris, and he spoke at the convention. I think it's also really critical. I'm not going to say one group is the most important or anything like that, but Jewish Voice for Palestine, Jewish Voice for Peace. I'm sorry, JVP is, I don't want to say the best known or what. That's an important group. It's a really important group, right? And they're being called anti-Semitic, but it's not really sticking, right? And you have groups like Students for Justice of Palestine,
and Never Again, or whatever.
Never Again, right?
Jewish group.
Yeah. There's Vets groups, Vets for Peace, and these like claims that they're ferocious anti-Semites, they're not working. They're not sticking. There was an article not long ago. I think there were like over 3,000 arrests in the spring. Almost all the charges have already been dropped. Clearly, it's intimidating. It's scary, right? To be arrested. Columbia and NYU are saying, we're not going to give you your diploma. We're not going to let you, go to your classes. You're not allowed on campus, that kind of thing. And what was it at Columbia? They have to write fucking essays in anti-Semitism to get reinstated. They're basically doing AIPAC propaganda to be reinstated.
Yeah.
And we've said this many times, right? There's anti-Semitism in America, right? You saw it in Charlottesville. You saw it in Pittsburgh. And Trump and the right wing praised it, right? The people who were opposing Israel today were also the most vigorous voices against anti-Semitism in the United States.
Yeah.
If you're an American lefty, then you're aware of the role that Jewish activists and Jewish radicals have played in our movement, right?
Yeah.
I don't know anybody like legit on the left who's anti-Semitic, right? They're not, right? But they're anti-Israel. That's easy to do. You can easily be both. Nothing hard about that. To be anti-Israel and to be against anti-Semitism. And the Democratic Party has done that. They've done that as much as the GOP has, right? And again, to go back to, I think it's an important point, although I keep repeating it, right? 1968 created the blueprint, the template for what the Democrats have been doing ever since then, right? Because in 1964, they owned the world. They had, I forget, 60 some senators, I believe a veto-proof majority in the House. Of course, so did Jimmy Carter in 1976 after Watergate, right?
Yep.
And they just pissed it away, right? They embraced these right-wing ideas about neoliberalism, and with Clinton, you had triangulation, and we got to get rid of welfare. We got to be tough on crime. We can't be seen as the party of affirmative action. We can't be seen as the party of civil rights. And we'll rely on the Supreme Court to take care of us because they all promised they would never overturn Roe v. Wade. And we're going to embrace and make a hero out of Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Hillary Clinton and all this Schumer and all this stuff. So I think 1968 is really visible in that regard. Yeah. A lot of these comparisons are just facile and they're not terribly useful. Oh, it's 1968 again. That's not the way history works, but you can compare things. But I think it's important in terms of the evolution. 1968 kind of lit the fuse that has been burning further and further to the right ever since then. And we're seeing that today, where you have these Democrats, allegedly, if you believe the right wing, the party of socialists and communists and radical left, Marxists and all that kind of stuff, right? Kamala Harris's father was a professor, Malcolm Harris, who worked in Marxist theory. He was friends with people like Cedric Robinson and others who were Marxists, right? Well, Kamala Harris isn't, but they still get attacked that way.
Yeah.
And the left doesn't, and they just keep backing off. And there's no affirmative response. There's no defense of what they believe in. It's insane that you would be afraid to speak out against what Israel is doing today, which has been condemned by all but 3 countries in the world. And it's probably going to get bigger. Yahoo clearly is putting, and I'd be interested to see what's going on behind the scenes, because for weeks now, Netanyahu is trying to expand the war into Lebanon and Iran, I'm sorry. And I recently did interviews with Iskander Siddiqui and Nate George about that, because the US media isn't really talking about it that much. Israel is trying to create a regional war, because if there's a regional war, the US has to get involved. It's not going to sit back and not do anything about it. And Netanyahu is clearly trying to pigeonhole Biden, Harris into that. We're gonna make you, the left doesn't understand the leverage they have. So Israel can exert that leverage and say, we're gonna make you support us even more. We're gonna lock you in right now because we're fighting against, Hamas and the axis of evil with the Revolutionary Guard and Hezbollah and all that kind of stuff, right? And since the Democrats just embrace that idea, you're going to continue war. Kamala Harris is not going to change things in Iran. I'm sorry, in Israel. It's not going to change. And they'll try to nuance around it for the election, and they'll go to Michigan and they'll make claims about how they want the war to end and all that kind of stuff. But I just don't think this whole kind of lefty fantasy, Diane Johnstone and Aaron Monte, all Biden has to do is make one phone call. Yeah, and all I have to do is, I don't know, learn to do dance and I could become the New York Ballet. I was like, it's about as likely, right? They're not going to make that phone call. There's nothing in the history of U.S.-Israeli relations to make that phone call. There's nothing in Biden's past. He's the biggest recipient of AIPAC money ever. And I sent you that speech he made in 1986 where he said, if Israel didn't exist, we'd have to invent it because it protects our interests in the region, right? The cop on the beat, the gendarme idea that Chomsky and others have promoted. And they can't speak out against that. They can't say genocide is bad. Think about that. These Democrats are demanding that people like you and me vote for them, but they're unwilling to say Israel's committing a genocide and we're against it. If you can't say that, then how the hell can you pressure me into voting for you?
Not only that, but they've convinced their, at least like core, their what I call the blue MAGA core, is that they're actually not responsible for it. That they've been in power on and off.
The White House they've controlled from 1992 most of the time.
Which has funneled a lot of money and weapons into Israel in that time. And even today, these like blue MAGA folks are like, why aren't you like taking this up with Trump? And we're like, he's not the one in power, right?
In the last 32 years, the Democrats have held the White House for 20 and the GOP for 12. Yeah, this has Democratic fingerprints all over it.
Not only that, but we actually have seen whatever Bush threw down for Israel hard, and Trump was
but Reagan too. In 1982, Reagan called Begin and said, "Get the hell out of Lebanon! Stop killing people in Lebanon."
Yeah, but Bush and Baker talked about limiting the amount of support we give, and Dole
because
did
of the
too when he was and Dole did too when he was Senate majority leader, and the AIPAC flipped out. But the Democrats have been lockstep.
Yeah. What did Jim Baker famously say? Fuck the Jews; they don't vote for us anyway. That's Jim Baker, Republican Secretary of State. So this has Democratic fingerprints all over it. And obviously, we're not defending Bush and Baker and Dole and all these people who are they're war criminals as well. But the reality is the Republicans have actually been more even-handed than the Democrats ever have.
Until Trump came in.
What's that?
Until Trump came in. But
I changed. They moved the capital to Jerusalem and all that crazy shit.
Yeah.
But it's just that's the lesson they always learned. And to go to activists and put this guilt trip and this pressure on them to support it, even though they're not doing what you wanted to do. And this is the point when you have leverage, you can say, hey, and this is what Democrats, I keep going back to the 2000 election when, Gore lost it. He ran a dismal campaign. He lost his own state. He lost Arkansas. He lost, I think, New Hampshire.
Which 2000.
What's that?
Which Bush lost in the primary in 2000.
Right. And from that point on, the Democratic line has been Ralph Nader cost us the election. And what is the American left and the Greens? What did they always say? No, we didn't. Blah, 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 blah. What you need to say is, yeah, we did. Jill Stein should have said that in 2016. Yep, we did. We cost you the election. You know what? We're going to do it again. We're going to do it again after that. If you don't start listening to us, if the right wing can make heroes out of the people from January 6th, if they can have Marjorie Taylor Greene and Matt Gaetz and J.D. Vance and all these crazies out there and embrace them, then we're not going to do your bidding for you anymore. Right? We are not going to be part of this. If you're going to go out and destroy Gaza and kill children and blow people up and tell people to go to a refugee camp and then blow that up and destroy, kill families, kill journalists, kill doctors. And they do all that and then get pissed off at you for mentioning it, right? For saying, hey, we don't like that.
It's really snipers play cat and mouse with children.
Yeah, think about that. I'm opposed to people killing little babies. And because of that, I'm helping Trump, right? I'm opposed to the genocide of children. Oh, you're pro-Trump. I think that's insane. That is utterly insane and terrifying. You can't be casual about what's happening. There are a lot of issues in the world. I get it, and there's a lot going on, but the destruction of an indigenous people, of people who are native to that area, who live there, who had their land taken from them, who have been failed by international institutions, right? That's an easy one. That's not like a two-sided thing, right?
Failed by their own institutions at that. It's just disgusting,
I mean,
honestly.
and it's okay to say that's the most important issue right now. It's okay to say that. I don't want Trump tariffs. I think they're going to mucky wrench everything. But at the same time, what's happening in Palestine is way worse than tariffs. Although, if tariffs lead to a greater confrontation with China, that's obviously not good. But and this country is right now. Look at the people like Blinken and Sullivan and Biden. There really are like cold-blooded war criminals.
Yeah, and unapologetic, and think that they're somehow humanitarian in their war crimes.
I think, to me, that's why it's important to study 1968 and to make these links, because it's part of an evolutionary process. It's not like history's come back again in full circle and the same thing is happening. In fact, what we're seeing today is way more sedate than 1968. And I think for the reasons we mentioned, that the lesson of 1968 was to just keep drifting further to the right.
Yeah, and just a final note related to that is that all of right now the big thing with liberals, particularly like these kind of hard dyed-in-the-wool liberals, is that you're letting fascism in. This is fascism. And what is the result of this sort of unregulated support for Israel and money and weapons, and anyone who opposes them being called anti-Semitic in the US and other parts of the world, is that's what's drifted us into fascism. If authoritarianism, I hate throwing out fascism is one of those words that's becoming, doesn't mean anything because it's thrown out so much, like we were talking about genocide, but still that's what's drifting us into this more authoritarian sort of society, is that we have this really immoral foreign policy, and where the country, in many ways, the government's just a weapons dealer. And that's what's pushing us into that more than anything else. And that's why we've been on this drift for so long, since 1968.
Yeah.
Just to put that out.
The constant refrain, like, you got to vote for the Democrats, Trump is worse. You just can't keep throwing that out there and not do anything.
No.
Maybe it'll work. Trump is a despicable character. And I know the funny thing is because you mentioned like the idea of fascism. Trump's a bad guy. Absolutely. And I have issues with fascism because that's a historical concept, which Trump does not embody because he has no ideology. There are Republicans who are more right. I think Miller and Bannon probably really would like to do that. But Trump is an idiot. He's a narcissist. And all he wants to do is rant and rave about crowd sizes and weird shit like that on Twitter or whatever. He's insane, right? But
it's definitely in decline.
Even Biden's out, absolutely. But Trump is mentally ill, right? I think Biden is just a product of age. With Trump, there's something like taking too much Adderall. He's loopy as hell. But the point is, if you believe that, and we've been hearing this since 2015, really, right? We've been hearing this for 8-9 years now. Trump is a fascist, the most dangerous thing ever. He's going to end American debate. And what's the solution? Vote for Hillary, vote for Biden, vote for Kamala Harris. If you really believe that these people pose this existential threat to American society, they say American democracy, which I don't think is a real thing anyway. But if you believe that, your only response is make sure you vote, right? We've been saying that for 9 years, right? That was why I wanted Biden to win in 2020, because that created a little bit of breathing space for people to organize. But what did they do? Not that much. You pointed out today, if Trump were the president doing this, there would be Democratic activists at every session of Congress, at every arms maker's headquarters, at banks, at McDonald's, at Starbucks. They would be everywhere, raising hell. I don't know if it'd be like the summer of 2020, probably not, but it would be a big deal if this were Trump doing it. But because it's Biden and Harris, people look the other way and they convince themselves that it's, hey, if a black woman is president, then she can commit genocide, but somehow that's different, right?
Yeah, I think it would look like 2003 if it was the Republicans that had done it. If the Republicans invade Iraq, we have the global superpower is the anti-war movement. I think it would have been very similar to that. I wonder, because of all the other things that have been at play that we've talked about, AIPAC influencing these institutions, it would have been as big, but still, it would a lot more liberals would have been out about it.
Yeah, I think, again, the lesson of 1968, which we're seeing today, is the Republicans embrace their far, no matter how crazy or violent it is, and the Democrats reject and resist what their people to the left of them, who, for the most part, aren't really leftists, right? They're not even like what you might call left, right? Not like in the Trump. Kamala, if you think Kamala Harris is a socialist, then there's nothing we can say, right? But the GOP in 1968 learned to embrace those kind of really crazy, bizarre, out of the world ideas. And the Democratic Party resists people who have popular ideas, actually, right? Abortion should have never become the issue it has, right? The Democrats had majorities throughout, many times throughout this last 50 years. They could have codified abortion rights. They never did. The majority of Americans have always supported abortion rights. We're seeing that now in every state that's had a vote on it, including red states like Kansas and Ohio. Abortion rights measures have passed with close to 60% of the vote everywhere. And I think what's interesting now is Trump is catching hell from a lot of the far right anti-abortion groups because he said this should be left up to the states. I'm not going to enforce the Comstock Act. I'm going to let women get medicine over through the mail and things like that, right? And the Democratic Party has this shit handed to them, and they can't do it. They are afraid to embrace those ideas. Anyway, we've gone on for about an hour now, and there's so much more we could say. But if you want to vote, go for it. I salute. But if you want to go into the streets and keep the heat on, that's not a bad idea. And remember, the Democrats.
This is the moment to do it.
This is the moment to do it, right? You have leverage. And I'm not going to sit here and say they're exactly the same or Trump and Harris are the same or whatever. I don't want to live in a world where Donald Trump's president again. I just don't want to be too old for this shit because he's insane. And he will hurt people I care about. But it's also time to put the pressure on Kamala Harris, like heavy duty. Now is when you have leverage. Tell her, unless you make these changes, we're not going to vote for you. You're not going to win. And you can make these, and their answer would be, if we make those changes, we'll lose the suburban one of Pennsylvania. And I would say, no, you won't. And even if you do, you'll get more out of it, right? It's like abandoning the white working class, abandoning the working class. There's a significant black working class, but the Democrats embrace them based on their racial identity, not their working class status. If you were to do that and embrace these ideas, yes, things have to stop. Israel has to stop doing this. And we actually do speak for all working people as working people who are economically precarious, right? And I got to believe that would win big, despite what Ruth Teixeira and Thomas Byrne Edsel and the editors of the Washington Post and everybody else says, right? The ruling class spokespeople, right? Or even what you get from what people on the left, what did you call the Brooklyn people, the Voice of America? What was it?
Voice of America's socialism.
Voice of America's socialism, right?
Yeah.
People who take the same position as NATO, right?
The nuclear industry.
Yeah, yes. And yeah, by the way, if you haven't, make sure you check out the interview we do with, was it MV Romana or VM? MV, right?
MV Romana.
MV Romana. Great. The guy's a scientist and he's against nuclear energy. Imagine that.
He's a nuclear scientist
he's
against nuclear energy.
Nuclear scientist. He's against the nuclear industry. And he is being attacked by Jacobin and all these other self-described socialists who they apparently have become the standard bearers of the left, right?
Yeah. And of the nuclear industry, apparently.
Anyway, we are diverging, but that's actually, I think, a product of this too, right?
Yep.
So we live in a right-wing country, but we do have some hope that most people don't actually think that way.
Yep.
And now is the time to put the heat on, right?
Yep.
Raise the temperatures, right?
Yep. Folks, you've been listening to the sweet and sultry sounds of the Green and Red podcast. If you like what you're hearing, check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you're watching this on YouTube, hit that subscribe button. If you're listening to us on an audio platform, give us a rate and review. If you want a hat, which is being stylishly modeled by Bob right now, you can email us at greenredpodcast@gmail.com, and we will take a $25 donation for that and send you a hat, shipping and handling included. And if you really like us, go to greenredpodcast.org and hit the support button, or go to become a patron at patreon.com/greenredpodcast. Like we said, this is the moment to be making trouble and misbehaving. So go out and do lots of that, and we'll talk to you again soon.
So your brother's bound and gagged, and they've chained him to a chair. Won't you please come to Chicago just to sing? In a land that's known as freedom, how can such a thing be fair? Won't Won't you please come to Chicago for the help that we can bring? We can change the world. Rearrange the world. It's dying to get better. Politicians, sit yourselves down. There's nothing for you here. Won't you please come to Chicago for a ride? And don't ask Jack to help you, 'cause he'll turn the other ear.